What impact will the Lamar Jackson contract have on the Baltimore Ravens, both in the present and the future? We talk about how Lamar's contract impacts 2023 and the rest of what the Ravens could do this offseason, also moving into the future and talking a bit about how he could impact Baltimore's moves then. Also diving into draft pick contracts, how that is changing over the course of the NFL landscape and what it means for the Ravens. All that and more coming up next on this midweek edition of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Ostreicher of Ravenswire, and we're here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for tuning in and making us your first listen each and every day. We're free and available all podcasting platforms, including over in video form on YouTube. And this episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who can take you on that journey of self-discovery from wherever you are. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off of your first month. And we're back. It's a midweek edition of the show, and we have Brian McFarland, Ravens salary cap, back with us here today of Russell Street Report. And Brian, I'm excited to have you back, and honestly excited that Lamar's deal is done so I can have you back on the show to talk about it. And it's crazy because the Odell deal gets signed. You're thinking, well, when's the next Lamar contract going to get signed? But now I feel like for what the Ravens have, there's a lot that goes into what this team is, and Lamar is the big part of that, the big piece. So how surprised were you at the end of the day that Lamar got this deal, especially on draft night when it all went down?
So I was, there was some rumors, some rumblings the day before. But we've had those before, so you couldn't be totally sure if it really meant anything. But I certainly think the Jalen Hurts deal getting done really kind of set the parameters in place for a new deal. And I think from that point forward, it was, obviously they were able to get it done. And so it's a big relief, I think, for all Ravens fans. And some aren't happy about the deal, I guess. But I think overall, hopefully, any of those, he will change their opinion as we go forward next season.
Right. And hopefully that's the case. I know you have ends up being a 5-year deal. So the next 5 years is going to be in Baltimore, 260 total money with 185 of that in practical guarantees and the 135, which was fully guaranteed at signing there. I mean, did you like the deal when you first got all the details? I know it only came out about a couple days ago because there was no agent to file the contract with. You got to get it from Lamar. How did you like the deal and the particulars of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty well in line with, at least the overall numbers are pretty well in line with the reported offer from back in September. I mean, it's really only $5 million more, or a couple, actually $2 million more per year because the deal back then was $50 million, and basically about $10 million more in fully guaranteed money. So, I mean, it's really, or just a couple million more. So really just right in line with that, which makes some sense because that's the way contracts generally work. The next guy gets a little more than the guy before. And so Hurts bumped it up a little for Lamar. And, but I think the Hurts deal, I think when we talked about this the last time, I didn't see a fully guaranteed deal like Watson's happening. So, the Hurts deal, I think in Cincinnati and San Diego, Los Angeles, aren't exactly cash heavy teams. So that, those two quarterbacks weren't likely or aren't still likely to get fully guaranteed. So, I think the Hurts deal, once that happened, at that point, Lamar decided, let's cut the best deal we can and move forward.
Yeah, and I know he kind of said in his press conference, Jalen didn't really impact, but I don't know. It felt like he was waiting on one of those, maybe call them the big four, like Hurts, Herbert, Burrow, Lawrence, to get that deal, and that maybe pushed things along. But in terms of actual flexibility, Brian, for what the Ravens can do now, obviously the first year cap hit for Lamar from the $32.4 million on the non-exclusive franchise tag, it is now down to $22 million. So it saves them about $10 million in cap space. Was that about where you were, at least what you projected the Ravens to get in savings? And then what can that do for them moving forward here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the numbers were a little different. The bigger signing bonus, I'd kind of put it right in that area, to be honest with you. I'd put a $60 million bonus and a $10 million um, um, base salary, which came out to 22 million. So I was actually a lot of my guesses were right there. The structure was different. Obviously, they want a bigger signing bonus, which will affect in the future. And of course, there are going to be several bonuses involved. From a team perspective, they probably would have liked to have a 6-year on there. From Lamar's perspective, certainly understand, especially since he got the no cap pledge, which is huge for him. So he doesn't have to go through this again the next time. From that standpoint, I mean, I think it all worked out pretty well for both sides. I think it's a fair contract. And for this year, it gives them that $10 million. Now, they haven't restructured any of their major contracts, their Stanleys, their Humphreys. They're going to have to do some of that. I mean, they only have about 13 million right now, and that's we don't know Rock Yassine's numbers yet, and the Zay Flowers still has to sign, so that's going to take a bite out of that 13, and your off-season numbers between not having space for injuries as the season goes on, your practice squad elevations and all. That's kind of like 15 million, in set asides you need. So right now they're still kind of underwater from a cap perspective, even though 13 million sounds really nice. So I always on Twitter always have to try and caution people that, who are we going to sign? Who are we going to sign? Not yet. But they've got those restructures in their back pocket, which they'll pull out when they need them, and they've got the flexibility to maybe even to use that 13. It's not this 13 per se that they're going to use, but they've got enough. I think they can make, with just simple restructures without void years, they can make another 26 if they wanted to. Now that's eating into the future cap space, so you want to be careful with that, especially since they've used void years to do that already. So it gives them the flexibility this year to, whether it's a Marcus Peters or whether it's a Justin Houston or another guy from the outside to come in. I mean, nobody's going to be terribly expensive at this point unless some big name gets inexplicably released or traded at this point.
Yeah, and I know there have been a lot of people who have talked about, Brian, the course of like, oh, well, they're going to sign like 5 different people. Like they're going to bring in Marcus Peters and Adrian Amos and JPP and Justin Houston. How many of those moves do you think is flexible? They have the flexibility to bring in with the current salary cap as it is right now and not touching anything?
Yeah, I mean, one of the factors is, will they continue to use void years? But, Justin Houston was $3.5 million last year. I don't think he's going up from that much. Pierre-Paul was a very minor deal. Now they both had incentives that they were able to get paid more. And Marcus Peters, it's an interesting one because I would have thought he would have signed somewhere for a decent enough deal. And clearly it doesn't. It doesn't sound like he's visited. There's been no news reports on him at all, really. And I know his tape wasn't the greatest last year, and he's hit 30. So, but he's still, a savvy veteran, and certainly other savvy veterans are getting signed. So he get $4 million, so I think they probably got a move or two in that $3 to $4 million range. And of course, if they use void years, they can take that number down to maybe 2 million, something like that. So I think Yassine's numbers, when we get those hopefully over the next couple of days, I think that'll be very telling again, whether they're going to continue to use the void years. And I would think Peters would be in that kind of range. And I think that actually all the guys we mentioned will probably be in that kind of range.
Yeah, and again, I think a lot has to do with, we don't really know what the Yassine numbers are because it was up to 6 million. So like Odell's like, what are those incentives to get him to that number? The Odell ones, seem pretty reasonable for some extent. Like I think he's probably going to hit a couple of them at least. But for Yassine, it could come in different measures. But do you feel like, Brian, there's one big move left for the Ravens? Or is it kind of they're done at this point? It's going to be smaller moves.
Yeah, I think it's probably smaller moves. And again, I don't know what the big move out there would be.
I mean, I think the Hopkins thing, when you draft Flowers, I think the DeAndre Hopkins thing, I mean, I think that ship sails, and I don't know that the Cardinals would move him now when you can't get a draft, your draft pick is until next year. So so I think that one, certainly that would probably be the big move. And again, I mean, maybe some big veteran gets unexpectedly released, or does, they pull a trade out. My guess is they will save cap space, and DaCosta lamented it 2 years ago when they did not have the cap space to make a in-season trade. And obviously, what it was Peters the year before, it was Peters the year 3 years ago, and then obviously Roquan Smith last year. So I think he likes to have that, arrow in his quiver, so to speak. So I think they'll hold some for that. And I mean, that could be the next big move. There's some minor moves now, but with the idea that when we need to go, with injuries or just a underperformance, we've got a hole in our roster, and there's a guy out there we can go get.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I feel like Eric DaCosta does like to save that. And also salary cap casualties later in the offseason. Once we hit the end of the preseason, guys will get cut then. So maybe there's not a guy that you like now at a certain position, but then come a couple months from now, there will be that. And then you can save that flexibility for them. Because, the Ravens, I think they've been in that market somewhat. Obviously, I think they like the guys they have. But there's a guy that unexpectedly becomes available, and it's at a position you need. I think Baltimore wants to be in that conversation. So I think Lamar's deal does give them flexibility for this year for sure. But coming up in the second part of the show, we'll be diving into what it means for the future years on that deal. So be sure to stay tuned. A ton to dive into on Locked On Ravens. But first, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp, and you can spend a lot of time on other people throughout the course of any given week, but how much time do you spend on yourself? For me, I want to make a balance between how much time I have for myself and then how much I actually go and spend on other people, because it's so easy to get caught up in what everyone else needs from you. And, sometimes you can never take a moment to think about what you need from yourself, how to recenter yourself, recalibrate after a tough week, etc. But when we spend all of our time giving, it can leave us feeling stretched thin and burned out. And therapy can give you the tools to find more balance in your life, so you can keep supporting others without leaving yourself behind. And there are so many different benefits to therapy, and so many people have had so many positive experience with it, whether it's from things like learning positive coping skills, now to set boundaries, to things like empowering you to be the best version of yourself. It can be so helpful, and it isn't just for those who've experienced major trauma. It is for everyone. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. We're back. Our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still here with Brian McFarland of Russell Street Report. And Brian, I know with this deal, how it was structured, I think a lot of people were excited to see the cap savings for this year. But then you have the cap hits, going up here from 22 to 33 in 2024. Then you have 43 and a half in 2025. And then 2026 and 2027, people probably looked at that deal and they're like, what, $74.5 million? Like, how is they going to manage that? How do you look at these cap hits and what they could actually be in terms of maybe you restructure it? Can you do that with this contract? What is the flexibility for the future years with this Lamar deal?
Yeah, I mean, it has a structure, and obviously, again, there's no franchise tag there, which pushes to get a deal done sooner rather than later, an extension sooner rather than later, and certainly that almost 75 million number does. Now, obviously, from our standpoint, the team's able to, they have a better idea of what they expect the cap to be in those years. Maybe it's not that crazy, because we're certainly expecting big spikes in the overall cap over the next few years. That said, usually by the fourth year of a deal, restructures or extensions are going to happen. We just heard today, there was some I would call it breaking news, but that the Chiefs and Mahomes were going to, go back to the draft. I mean, he's woefully underpaid. He's been woefully underpaid. I mean, that deal was a sweetheart deal for Kansas City. And he, he never got a big signing bonus. I mean, and his big cap numbers are really just starting to hit. That's where you go in and say, okay, well, instead of, a huge $50 million salary, $51 million salary in Lamar's fourth year, then we're going to extend, we're going to give you most of that or more in a signing bonus, and we're going to drop that down and then spread that money out. So I would think, and I mean, Joe Flacco's deal was the same way. The first 3 years were relatively reasonable, and the fourth year, went up. Now, some people have pointed out that fourth year isn't guaranteed presently. That's the key, presently. And they're missing the point that will become fully guaranteed if he's on the roster sometime in March of the third year. And he's not going anywhere at that point because you've got a lot of dead money in place. So that's a bit of a fallacy that it's a 3-year deal and then we could cut him and move on. It's not really structured that way, because before that third year, that big fourth year, that $51 million fourth year is going to become fully guaranteed. And that's these vesting options, which a lot of these kind of deals use. And that's why the deal really comes out to be pretty close to, it's really over 200 million fully guaranteed. I mean, the reality is, call it a virtual guarantee or practical guarantee. It's not fully guaranteed, but it essentially is. So that's where the rubber meets the road. And obviously, if now, maybe if he has 2 terrible years, God forbid, over the next 2 years, maybe they bite the bullet and get rid of him and take the big cap hit before it gets worse, so to speak. But certainly they're not, they didn't do this deal planning on that. They did this deal planning on, in sometime in 2025 or 2026, we're going to extend him out and go from there.
Yeah, and so I feel like with even like the no tag and the no trade clauses, I feel like Baltimore was willing to do that because they were so adamant throughout this process that this is our guy. We want him here. He's our quarterback. It's a win for Lamar for sure to have those 2 clauses. Like that is an absolute, if you're saying who won that, Lamar wins that, but I don't think the Ravens really care because they want Lamar in Baltimore.
No, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, in theory, these next 5 years are the best 5 years of his career. Right. He's still in his 20s for most of those years. Not the quarterbacks can't play well into the 30s, but when running is a big part of your game, maybe at 31 or 32, he starts slowing down. I mean, he's pretty superhuman, but at some point, he may slow down some, and then maybe 5 years down the road, everybody's willing to move on. Who knows? Even if he plays well. Or if they just can't get the deal done, we'll move on. So I don't think they're, planning on that, certainly. But, I think it's structured so that they can, if worst case scenario, it happens that way, it happens that way.
And I'm excited. I know the Ravens and obviously Lamar to see him in this new offense under Todd Monken, and kind of how he can air this football out. I mean, he said, throwing for 6,000 yards. Right. The LJ 6K is now what they're calling him. So right. I'm excited to see that and just how much of that running is a part of his game. Obviously, it is. Like, he is a dual threat guy, amazing arm, amazing legs. But I'm excited to see that. But Brian, you look at the void years again, 2028 and 2029. It's an $8 million cap hit and then a $4.5 million cap hit. If the LDL deal didn't happen the way it did, I'm sure we'd be sitting here saying like, oh, wow, they use void years. Like, this is so new. But it seems like now they're willing to dip into that pool and use the void years. So what do those void years mean for this deal in particular? And I mean, were you shocked that you see a couple at the end of this?
No, I wasn't, because, once I saw there's a signing bonus initially, and then there's an option bonus next year, and then another option bonus the year after. And once I saw that third option bonus, I was pretty sure that they were going to have void years in there, because the option bonuses can only be spread out over the remaining years of the contract. Well, if it's a 5-year deal and in the third year you get an option bonus, if it's a straight 5-year deal, that bonus only gets spread out over those 3 years, years 3, 4, and 5. You add the 2 void years on, and you can spread it out over the maximum of 5. You can't spread out any more than 5 under the CBA. So that didn't surprise me. It does mean if the contract ends after 5 years and he moves on, then they do have $12.5 million in dead money on the cap. But that's in 2028. They took, was it like $16 million dead money when they traded Flacco? And that was, 5 years ago. So 12.5 million sounds like a lot, and you'd rather not have to deal with it. But in 2028, that's not going to be, compared to where the cap's going to be. It's not going to feel, it's not going to hurt as much as it sounds, I guess, because the cap is going to be, geez, 250. I don't know, I'm sorry, 350. I shouldn't say 250. It's 225 this year. So 350, maybe not that high, but it's certainly going to be over 300 by then. So, so that's so in a way, I mean, I think, especially when you're using void years that far off, now all the other void years they use this year will hit next year. And I think that's like 7 between Odell and the others. And the others were relatively minor, but I believe it's close to 20 million in dead money. So that hurts because that's next year, whereas a void years 6 years down the road and 12.5 million. Well, it sounds like a lot. I don't think that's now. So it'll be interesting. Next year will be interesting to see if they continue to use them, or if this was just, we need to get Lamar done, and once we got Lamar done, we needed to work it out so we can create. And again, because it's the 5 years, I mean, you look at a lot of these other deals. Hertz's deal was 6 total. Allen's deal was 8 total, I think, and Mahomes' deal was like 10. So, the longer the deal, the more you can spread those out. If this is a 7-year deal, you don't need the void years because you've got those prorations. You don't need to add that on or worry about taking that dead money on the back end.
Yeah, and there's so many intricacies of these contracts too, which makes it so interesting how they can all be different. And how this is, going into this process, Brian, I said deals like this don't come together quickly, especially one of this magnitude where the Ravens have never had to shell out this kind of money for a player before. So it was new territory. I mean, we can talk about the Flacco deal, but this is on a whole other stratosphere compared to what that was. But then people are interested, I think, in terms of what this still means for the future, Brian. Like, for example, Eric DeCosta went on the lounge and talked about Patrick Queen and said, well, we'd love to have Patrick Queen back. And I'm thinking, well, I'm sure they'd love it, but can they do it is the question. And that's key here.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, they rarely, and especially for a guy who's on the roster still, I don't think he's going to come out and say, well, we'll see, we'll say goodbye to Patrick at the end of next year, or this coming season even. So, but I really didn't think they were going to trade him because I just don't think the trade value was there. And certainly now that the draft is gone, now could he be a guy potentially that could be used as a trade chip in, if they feel Simpson's come along well and it's midseason, it's trade deadline, and can we trade Patrick for somebody to come in that can help at a different position? I mean, I could see that, but I mean, I think they do value him. And as DeCosta said, I mean, he played really well, and the two of them together. So, do you weaken your team by trading him for a 5th round pick? I don't know that that's worth it, So what didn't surprise me, they traded him now. And I think DeCosta is right to an extent. He said it was economics, and $12.7 million for Queen next year on the cap. That's hard to do. That's going to be hard to do. I think they have about, I haven't worked it all up with the rookie signings yet, but I think they'll have about 21 million in cap space at this point. Now, there are going to be cuts and all those kinds of different things that go on. So, but if you take 12.7 million of that 21, I mean, that's, it's over half. That's a big chunk of it. If they did extend him, if they did actually get down to talking to him, here you go. Now his cap number in the first year is 4 million. And that's your 2024 cap number is 4 million, not 12.7. So I think he's right and it's fully guaranteed as well. So if Queen gets hurt and can't even play, so I think it's a strategic / economic move, and it buys him another year to see if Queen, if the second half of last year was real or mirage. And if it turns out it was a mirage, then you're not obligated to that 12.7. And if it's real, then you either get a nice contract out of him. You can always franchise him if need be. At that point, then that's going to, linebackers are all shoved into one, so it's not 12.7. Unfortunately, it's going to be higher than that. But but I think from that standpoint, I think it buys them another year to figure it out without exposing themselves to difficulty or trying to trade him for because nobody's going, if he stinks, nobody's trading anything for him for a $12.7 million cap number.
Yeah, and I think for what the Ravens have now, we've seen those two play together, Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen, the value that they can provide. And I say, Brian, it's like they're pushing their chips in the middle, but it's not like the Rams where that was literally that year. And if they didn't win the Super Bowl that year, it was it, and that was a failure. Where if they don't win this year, they can still like be competitors. Obviously, you have Lamar there. He's the key to this whole thing. But obviously, you have Odell on the 1-year deal. Rakisin's on the 1-year deal. Sign Aguilar too. A couple free agents. I know there's questions about will the Ravens pay J.K. Dobbins after this season if he has a great year. So there are those questions. But again, you now have like how are the Ravens able to sign Roquan to that deal when Lamar was still unsigned? How are the Ravens able to sign Marcus Williams? Well, Marcus Williams and his cap hit is $7 million this year.
That's going to go up. These first 2 years, that's going to go up big time.
Oh, 100, yeah. Same with Roquan Smith, and how they signed him to that deal. You look at Roquan Smith, like how were they able to get him? His cap hits $9 million on a 5-year, $100 million contract, and it's almost like the big Andrews and Stanley and Humphrey contract is those go out, the other ones will slot in, and it's a nice little slide that they have there, and I think it's a good way to structure things. But coming up in our final segment, we'll wrap up the Lamar conversation about the future and also talk about the Ravens draft picks and their contracts, so we should have stayed tuned. Still a ton to dive into on Locked On Ravens here. We're back rounding out Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still here with Brian McFarland. And Brian, just wrapping up the Lamar conversation. I know there are some people that are worried about, well, now Lamar signed this deal and there are all these cap hits. How are they going to be able to keep everybody or make moves in the future? You talked about they had about 21-ish million in cap space, at least projected now for next year. Is there any worry in your mind that this Lamar contract will at some point hinder their ability to improve their team, or is that not a concern for you?
Well, I mean, obviously with this kind of contract, injury, of course, is a big concern, and it goes for any player, obviously. He doesn't turn out to be the player they hope and expect, or he looks more like Lamar of the latter part of last year versus the MVP. I mean, you've got those. I'm sure you're happy it's done, but it doesn't come without trepidations for sure. So, but I mean, as long as he plays well, they'll be happy to pay him and pay him more and extend it, So, and obviously, as long as, as electric as he is, as long as he's healthy, I mean, on any given play, be it with his arm or his legs, he can change the complexion of the game. So, you can skimp in other areas, and if they have to win games, they have to skimp on defense at some point and have to win games 58 or 38-35, because your defense isn't as good. Well, as long as your offense is good and Lamar's there and can, like I said, can turn one play into pay dirt, then, I think that you're going to have to. I mean, it's just the way it is. They're going to have to rely on draft picks, and that's why they loaded up on draft picks the last couple of years. I think it was 29 draft picks over the 3 prior years. Now this year was only 6. Next year they'll have 7 because I know they traded one. They traded their 6th this year for Voorhees, but they have a 7th for Chuck Clark next year, so they'll still have at least 7 picks. They drop down around, but Voorhees is going to be almost like a 6th-round draft pick next year. I mean, he's going to redshirt, and so I thought that was a great move for a guy that's supposed to be a 3rd or 4th-round pick. And you only get 3 years, not 4 years of him, but assuming he, his injury happened back, in January or was it February? So, he's got it by the time he hits the field next September. He's got 18 months of recovery. So I mean, they're going to have to pick and choose. I mean, they've always had to pick and choose. With Flacco's deal, they were picking and choosing, and so that's that. But they're going to have to draft well again. I mean, that's the bottom line. I mean, they're in their heyday years, they were able to let big name players go because they were drafting so well. And I mean, I think they've come a little more back to the pack than they were. I mean, they were so good at it for so many years. And now they're just very good or good, or wherever you want to put it. They're certainly in the top half, but I think other teams have just gotten better and made it. I mean, there's just so much information out there now that didn't exist back in the the late 90s and early 2000s. So, but that's going to be the key now, especially they're going to hoard draft picks like they never have before, and they've always done it, because they're going to need that cheap labor. But if they can draft well, I don't see any concerns, going forward. I don't think the contract's going to. I mean, it's going to, like I said, it's going to make things a little more difficult, but I don't think it's certainly the end of the world.
Yeah, so no second round draft picks traded anymore, Brian. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess if that one guy is out there, but of course they can always trade a second round and then move back in the first and pick up extra picks. They didn't do it this year because Flowers was sitting there waiting for them. But yeah, but I mean, I think they just gonna have to draft well. I think that's the bottom line, and that's always been their bread and butter.
Yeah, it has been. And speaking of draft picks, Brian, it seems like the Ravens, they only had 6 guys this year. It's not like the 10 and 11 players of the years past over the past few years. So all but one player is signed, and that is Zay Flowers. At least at the time of this recording, he's not signed. Do you know what the holdup is with that contract and kind of why it hasn't been put pen to paper yet?
No, I don't think so. I mean, league wide, I think only about 20% maybe, and that may be high, of players have been signed. So and first round, these are all slotted. So there's really, for first round picks, it's going to be fully guaranteed. That over time they went from, in the first year of this new slotted system, I think maybe only the top 15 players got fully guaranteed. And then the next year it was 16 or 17 and 18, and it just went up. And now, so this past year was the first year all first round picks were fully guaranteed. Now the second round picks are started, higher second round picks are starting now. So it just kind of moves along that way. So the only issue really for first round picks now is or offsets, that if you get cut by the Ravens and it's fully guaranteed, but you sign with somebody else, the Ravens get that money back for whatever you signed with the other team. I don't see where that's a holdup. It used to be holdups in the top 10, because now granted, if you're the top 10 and you get cut, I'm not sure what the offsets really matter, but it became an issue. So I don't see it being an issue. They just had their first, their mini camp, I think, over the next couple of weeks. I think I'm trying to remember what 2 players last year, one of them being Ajabo, which didn't really matter because he wasn't. And now that was partially about how they were going to handle him on NFI or PUP, because it has an effect on his future free agency or earning a year towards free agency. So I think that's why that one took so long. But there was somebody else that signed relatively late, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense. But, as long as they're there at OTAs and, it doesn't really matter. They'll get done.
Yeah, and the thing with Ajabo was, didn't his situation make him not be able to go on IR when it happened, and they had to keep him on the roster?
Well, there was something about they missed the timing for the NFI designation. They had to put him on at the beginning of camp, but I'm not sure that really. I don't know that was really it, because if he'd gone on NFI, he would not have accrued a season towards free agency. Which would have meant, instead of being a free agent after his 4th year, it would have been after his 5th year. The Ravens would have had him for 4 years, not 5 years, for the last year and then 4 more, because he wouldn't have been a free agent after the 4th year. So I think that was probably his agent saying, we don't want NFI, and kind of forcing them to, and the Ravens are usually pretty good. We'll be interested to see how they handle Voorhees as well. Because he could go on NFI, even though non-football injury, but unfortunately, even though they both were football injuries while working out, and Ajabo's I think his was at Michigan during his pro day, I think.
Yeah.
And Voorhees was obviously at the combine. So, they sound like football injuries to me, but they don't count, unfortunately, for this. So, so I think we'll probably see him go on PUP at the beginning of camp, and then obviously stay on the whole year, because it doesn't sound like there's much chance of him being back. Ajabo kind of got back, but he never really, obviously did he see a snap at all? I saw a couple snaps, I think.
Yeah. He saw a couple, but I think, Voorhees doesn't have I think it's probably a redshirt year for him.
Yeah,
He'll just
yeah,
be
for
there,
sure.
not play the year. But it's crazy to think, Brian, how like the contracts of these draft picks have changed, and not even just first rounders. I mean, I think it was for, I don't know how many years it was, but the third rounders, it took forever. I think didn't it take them forever to sign Ben Cleveland a couple years ago because of what? Maybe I'm remembering it wrong, but
Yeah. So
could have
the
been
third
him.
round picks have the ability. After that, every first year, every player, first round through seventh, through even undrafted guys get the minimum base salary, and of course then they get their signing bonus. Then for first and second round picks, those contracts go up 25% each year, whereas the other draft picks, certainly used to be 4 through 7, would just have the minimum base salary, which goes up about $100,000 each year, give or take. In the past, the third round, though, there was some ability. They didn't get 25% adjustment, but they got more than those minimum base salaries. So it could be something like just $20,000 or 30 or 50 or something like that. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there. Now, as of this last draft, all of the third round picks got the maximum, so they did get the 25%. So, and again, it was it was the first in the beginning in the third round picks, the first couple got that, and then became 10 and then 12 and so forth. And now the fourth round is the sort of the battleground. Robinson was picked later in the fourth, so he just got a straight old-fashioned deal. No 25% bump. All his base salaries are just the minimum salaries, and of course the signing bonus. And the signing bonus is the only thing guaranteed. So Simpson was easier to sign as a third round pick, just because again he was going to get that 25% bump each year, since that was precedent based on last year.
Yeah, and it's crazy now that we're seeing these undrafted guys getting more guarantees than sixth rounders. Like, I know we were talking before the show, Brian. It's almost better to be undrafted now than it is to be a sixth or seventh rounder.
Oh yeah, being Mr. Irrelevant is not a good thing. I mean, it really isn't, unless you go to the right team like Brock Purdy did, and fate, intervenes. But obviously, nobody ever, when they drafted him, never expected it to come to that. So, yeah, I mean, some of these guarantees, some of these were big guarantees. And the Ravens usually don't give those. And I remember Ozzie going way back is, we're not offering you money, we're offering you an opportunity. And and you come here, and back then they had that streak of undrafted free agents that was forever. And I think 2 years ago maybe it was, that ended.
Yeah.
I think they've given a little bit, and we haven't seen all of the numbers on the undrafted free agents, but the most they gave was a $40,000 guarantee on base salary, and I think that was a bonus, so it was 60 total, because there was a signing bonus plus the 40. And now that it doesn't really matter that much, because all of those deals have offsets. So that 40, and the guys that are getting the big, I mean, they're going to be on that team's practice squad, and that's going to offset what they, so every week. Every week that they're on the practice squad, that just offsets that guaranteed money. So, or if they end up signing somewhere else, same thing. There's offsets there. So the team, as long as the player isn't just a total bust and doesn't play anywhere, the team's really getting that money back.
And it's such an interesting, all these contracts. Now, I mean, by the time maybe like 2040, seventh rounders will have their contracts fully guaranteed, just with the way the TV deals are, the cap. But the Ravens, again, only Zay Flowers is left for them, at least at the time of this recording. So hopefully that gets shored up pretty quickly. Brian, I appreciate you hopping on. Thanks so much
Absolutely.
for joining me here. And please tell people where they can find you and what you're working on now.
Sure. So I'm at Raven Salary Cap on Twitter, as long as Twitter stays around, and or whatever. We'll figure out what comes next, if something comes next. And then obviously my articles are on Russell Street Report. Anytime you need the most up-to-date cap space, that's the place to find it. And contract details, there's a page there for all of those. And then anytime I need to write an article, which from here on probably won't be many, but obviously in January and February and March, that's when my writing days come back. So that's where to find me.
Yeah, be sure to check it out. All those will be in the description below. Be sure to give him a follow on Twitter too. It is the most up-to-date Ravens salary information, so be sure to check him out there. But Brian, I appreciate you again. Thank you so much. And that's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm gonna get back here tomorrow. More Ravens content, so be sure to stay tuned for that, and I'll see you right back here tomorrow.